So is mine. I should go out and walk around.
All right. Well, shall we call the meeting to order? I guess it shouldn't be a question. Meeting's called to order.
Okay.
And on the agenda today, let's see, do we want to take a look at the agenda and want to take a look and then make a motion to approve or amend?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Anyone disagree? Moving on. So let's see. So I think our big discussion item for the day is the spending limit, and we'll get to that after we hear from the assembly and the school district, I believe. But I don't think, but we don't have anyone from the assembly present right now.
No, not at the moment. So we can skip that, Mr. Chairman, and then just go straight to the school board unless Desiree has something from the assembly office she wants to point out right now.
As far as budget and finance goes, I know next week we've got you guys discussing the state impacts, and that's a big priority for the assembly right now, especially since we're coming into budget season. So they're just kind of trying to figure out what they want to do and what our options are.
Okay.
I would throw in a couple things on the assembly front. Jed, Alyssa, and I yesterday met with Forrest Dunbar and Austin Quinn Davidson, who are co-chairs for the Assembly Finance Committee, Budget and Finance, and they did share some thoughts with us as far as what 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 they'd like to see from BAC, and I thought some of their comments were helpful. They wanted to just take a little bit of time to talk to us in a little more detail about some of the stuff we're working on. They felt that on their punch list of items that the stormwater utility was one of the top things they could use help with, and so I think that that's probably one of the things that we're going to want to get up to speed with pretty quickly if that's the will of this group, because I think that probably the time is right now to start looking at some of the specifics and make some recommendations. I believe the assembly approved the creation of the utility this week. Is that right, Brian?
Correct.
So that's one. The possibility of a tax on e-cigarettes is one also that there's some interest in. That's been discussed before on some level. The spending cap was there. The impacts of state actions on the budget, I think, is another huge category with a lot of pieces to it. So there's a lot that we could dig into there. We did hear some thoughts on actually what our topic is for today about the spending limit, and that they didn't see it as much of an obstacle from an assembly standpoint. That it's not very top of mind for them. Obviously, if it hasn't always been even calculated, then it's not incredibly top of mind. And they were a little bit worried about some of the political optics of making an ordinance change to it that it might rile up opposition or somebody, or the appearance of removing or weakening spending constraints. And it's not actually what would be happening, but that was a concern that they had if they acted upon it, then that would be an issue potentially. That if there would be the perception that they were removing a constraint on spending, even though that's not really the case. So, I don't know if you want to throw anything into that, Jed or Alyssa.
I would just echo that exactly how I understood it.
So that's one piece about the spending that's worth mentioning. But I don't know if anyone had any discussion on any of those things. Cool. Then I guess let's hear from the school district.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We finished our fiscal year on June 30th, and we are now starting to close out our books and prepare our financial statements. Most of what we've been doing is watching the well-oiled machine that is our state government currently and what effects that has on us, and then trying to identify what those are and then how we're going to overcome the obstacles, particularly the bond debt, which is the school district, a little over $20 million, almost like that half of our reimbursement. We'll be working with the city and those administrations to see what options we have to come up with those, including use of fund balances from probably either party or going to the taxpayers to make up that at some point in the future.
didn't hear how things got resolved with the whole discussion about the forward funding of education in the last session, and then there was a standoff between the legislature and the governor about the legality of that.
Right, so we're expecting, I don't think they have actually filed a lawsuit to say that the forward funding for FY21 was cut out of the budget, as you know, so that'll just be at the discretion of lawmakers once they come back in the next session. But for the roughly $2.5 million that ASD was slated to get for FY20 for the current fiscal year, that is kind of what's in question, which Governor Dunleavy says was unconstitutional for them to appropriate, and they want to. So that's kind of in limbo whether we'll get that or not, and that'll be for any court decision once that's filed, I guess. The other thing we're looking at is the governor's starting to withhold the state's payments to school districts for our foundation payments, which come on the 15th of every month. So we're anticipating not getting that, I guess that's Monday. The anticipation after that is once they don't pay us, the state will be, a lawsuit will be filed, an injunction put in where they do pay us like 7 to 10 days later or something. That's what we received a letter from the Commissioner of Education kind of detailing what he thought the process was going to be. So that's what we're looking at now. Most of the school districts around the state probably cannot sustain operations without getting even that first payment. They're on a pretty tight cash flow. Anchorage, we're in a little bit better situation than most of the other districts where we can sustain operations for a couple of months without having to have mass layoffs. But we are preparing contingency plans for in case this does go into September, October timeframe.
That funding from the state. What is that? Is that tied to the state the base?
Yes, the foundation formula is the base student allocation, right. And how that paid on the first student.
Yes.
Andy, was that the governor actually withheld that, or it's part of this budget that they're fighting over?
They finally paid us the last year's in June for the $20 million, but they haven't paid the $30 million that's due to the districts for FY20. They haven't paid yet. Typically, they don't pay that until February, March timeframe anyway. So there's quite a bit of time for them to work it out. But if we find out later, we don't really have as much time to react whenever we're on contract. We're 90% people, and once we're on contract, we can't necessarily get rid of them at the drop of the hat. Particularly our teachers, who are the ones we hired now, are on contract for the entire year regardless. So yeah, it's, for us, for Anchorage, we anticipate it's about $8.4 million from the state, and then another $2 million or so that we can collect in local funds that is the local allowable contribution that's tied to the state funding. So if the total state funding goes down, so does the amount we can collect from the city.
Anything else on that? Questions? I think we're ready for your portion.
So very briefly, in your packet, for just the status on how we're doing on the first quarter, departments are doing a very good job on managing their funds. I've included in a monthly report that we gave to the Assembly, and we give to the Assembly every month, and it just shows how departments are doing overall. And this is through the end of May. We're at, basically at that point in time, we're about 40% through the year. Departments overall are underspent. They're at about 36% spent on their labor. Their non-labor is at 41%. So right now, they're doing very well. We have a couple departments that are run a little hot, and other departments that are doing, just due to seasonality. But I don't have any cause for concern right now. Just as a monthly report, and I'll be sharing this with you monthly, as I'll be sharing, and it looks like should be a table that looks like this. You guys got a copy of that? And so if you have any questions, just let me know. I wasn't going to kind of run through this. I want to give Bill and Marilyn the time to talk about the spending limit and the tax cap. But so far, so good. I don't see any surprises. There's, I think over time for most of the departments that we see right now, they're doing very well. We haven't seen how June looks because I think the fire department's going to have a little bit of that. And so, and the revenue side, just hearing from revenues from Dan Moore, the revenues are up about $900,000 over our projections for 19. So out of $700 million in revenue, when they're $1 million plus, we're doing pretty good. So overall, city's doing great. per 19. This is the foundation that we use as we get into the budget season for 2020, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So right now, nothing that's causing some concerns. But if you guys have questions, after you take a look at it, let me know. I mean, just as an example, it looks like the non-labor in the Assembly's office is really high. It's because they spent all their non-labor in the elections. The rest of that stuff's just going to calm down for the rest of the year. You'll see some departments like street maintenance or parks and rec, and it just spikes high because they're doing a lot of cleanup, and then it'll go down. So there's fluctuations in there. So if you have questions, let me know.
I just really appreciate this kind of report and seeing this on a monthly basis. Not necessarily because I need to ask questions about the details, although maybe we might, but I think that they'll help kind of just understand the pulse and the respiration pattern of the municipality overall. Just the ebb and the flow of how the budget works. So thanks for preparing.
Yeah. So the next item I have is is the main topic, which is the spending limit and tax cap. And just real briefly for members, many of you know Bill Falsey is the municipal manager, previously the municipal attorney, and Marilyn Bonzoff was deputy director in OMB. Our specialties in tax cap and spending limit. And so I invited both of them to sort of give you a rundown of this. But our task at hand is this. The Assembly has put a hiatus on the spending limit. We are in a process at the administration to formalize where we put the spending limit and the tax cap all into one place for particular reasons. Bill's going to give you a little bit of history of why we have two and why we shouldn't. And then Marilyn will kind of run down how the tax cap works, because that really is the spending limit that we have. And so I've asked them to sort of do this, and what I'd like for you to do is to take a look at this. You have some draft information in front of you. Look at this. We'll craft a resolution for you. I'd like you to consider formulating a position on behalf of the Budget Advisory Commission at your meeting in August so that we can give this to the Assembly as we go into the budget season. So that's our task at hand. So unless you have any questions, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Falsey and have him sort of give you a history lesson of why we are where we are and how come we got the two created. So I'll leave it to you, Bill.
All right. Thanks, Lance. So as Lance said, I'm Bill Falsey. I'm the English municipal manager, used to be the municipal attorney. And we come to you today with a potential solution for the puzzle that is the spending limit. So I'll confess that when I became a municipal attorney, I was well aware that we had a city with a tax cap. And while we were developing the budget one year, at the very end of the process, we also turned the crank on the spending limit, to which I turned to Marilyn and said, spending limit? What is the spending limit? As it turns out, there's a bit of a history here, and I'll commend to you, if you ever have a spare moment, and you find your way to the UAA Consortium Library. The UAA Consortium Library inherited the old galleys of the Anchorage Times archives, and back when newspapers used to be flush, apparently there was an archivist who was employed by the Anchorage Times who every day would take the two newspapers and cut them up into different themes and paste them into binders. So you can pull a binder off the shelf that says Assembly 1983 and relive the 1983 Assembly days. That was very helpful for this project because in trying to figure out why we have this spending limit, I went to that binder and sort of relived that summer. And in the early 80s, there was a national vogue for some kind of taxpayer bill of rights, spending limits. There was the one that was adopted in Colorado. And there was a groundswell movement that came from a couple directions for the tax cap that we have now. Don Smith, who likes to call himself the father of the tax cap, proposed one in the Anchorage Assembly chambers that did not pass and was pretty different from the tax cap that we actually have. Meanwhile, there were two other people who are listed in this memorandum here, Millet Keller and Linda Rexwinkle. Millet Keller was working through the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce. I understand that he made some money building early software for resource companies, and I think he ended up in Texas. Linda Rexwinkle was with a group that I haven't been able to find much information about, which is called the Free Committee of the Anchorage Women's Club. And they proposed the tax cap that we have, and it was voter-initiated. Ahead of the signatures and getting it to the ballot, the Knowles administration proposed a spending limit. And I'll leave it to you to speculate what the politics of all that was. But suffice to say, the spending limit that the Knowles administration proposed was at the time significantly more permissive of government spending than the tax cap would allow you to bring in revenues. And when it was proposed in the Assembly chambers, Mr. Keller, who was leading the charge and who had been the lead drafter of the tax cap, came in and said, if we pass the tax cap, the spending limit ordinance is going to be defunct. But if we don't pass the tax cap, this is at least better than nothing. Well, wind the clock forward, we did adopt the tax cap, but we had already adopted the spending limit, and we didn't do anything about the two of them. In the early years, it didn't much matter because the spending limit, if it had been calculated, would have been much larger than the tax cap for a variety of in-the-weeds considerations of how that formulas work. Over time, though, it changed, and every time that the spending limit would have been more restrictive than the tax cap, it was either ignored or just not calculated at all. And the spending limit was never required to be reported to anywhere, so it's actually really difficult to find some of the years what the spending calculations were. We had to recreate them. Marilyn and I were digging through some old binders. But the takeaway for us was it is an odd feature of the municipality to have a ratchet that limits the amount of taxes coming in and a separate ratchet that limits the amount that you can spend. And there was a public policy question as to why you need both of those. Further observation that the spending limit has never actually had any real-world effect. Every time it would have been more restrictive than the tax cap, it was ignored or kind of massaged because some of the terms are actually underdefined about when you calculate the spending limit. Is it when you propose the budget or when you revise the budget? So there were certainly times where the Assembly adopted a budget that was not that could not be squared with the spending limit, but was always squarable with the tax cap. So when we were calculating a budget in the early days, must have been 2016, the budget for 2016, we sort of encountered this problem and this question and went to the Assembly and said, we don't think this makes sense. And at the time, the Assembly agreed to sort of pause it, put it on ice for a few years, and to study it. And so we did that work, and we actually put our thinking caps on and thought, is there any public policy reason to have both a tax cap and a spending limit? And I think the answer is actually yes. So if you have a tax cap that limits the amount of money you can bring into the municipality, what separate utility could a spending cap actually do? A spending cap could, as we're proposing here, prevent you from also blowing through your savings in a way that is not responsible. So the municipality has a resolution, which is not in law, which says we have announced that we have a debt reserve policy. And our debt reserve policy is we're going to keep 10 and 12. We're going to keep 10%, 10 and 2, which gets you to 12. We're going to keep in the bank an amount equal to 10% of what we spent last year as our bond reserve, bond rating reserve, so that we will continue to be AAA. So the bond rating agencies like it when we come to them and say, in case of emergencies, we've always got a little bit of a cushion. And then on top of the 10%, we offer another 2% for just emergency expenditures, not necessarily protect the bond rating, but something like an earthquake just happened and we need to temporarily dip into some emergency reserves. So the proposal is, instead of having this nearly similar but actually pretty different formula, which is just competing with the tax cap in a way that is not obviously meritorious, to say that the Assembly would stamp that reserve, to say, in addition to throttling the amount of money that you can take in through the tax cap, the reason for a spending limit is to say, you can't also blow through your savings. And blowing through your savings means you got to comply with the bond reserve policy that we have already put in front of the Assembly. So I think that would sort of clean up a long lingering problem and sort of remedy the past of ignoring it when it was inconvenient, making it real and actually serving a real purpose. I'm happy to answer any questions the group has them.
The bond reserve policy is in place, or?
It's in place, and I don't know, I think I sent it to Lance. I don't know if it made it to you, but we have sent it to the Assembly at least twice. It's a resolution, and it says, as I described, 10 and 12. Yeah, it's AR 2015-84. Maybe you guys got copies of that. I'm not sure you did. If you didn't, we can certainly provide them. And then there's a separate section for how all the limited road service areas work. They have a different bond reserve policy, a different reserve policy because they aren't rated by the bonding agencies. They don't float their own revenue bonds or general obligation bonds.
Questions?
So could you go, I was listening to everything you're saying, and I think the part that I miss is the practical negative impact of having both, because I thought I heard you say that when the spending limit would come into play, it's usually ignored, and so does that mean that it's...
So the spending limit is hard to parse, the existing spending limit that we have now, and you can see it here rendered in the all capital letters on page 2 of the existing ordinance. But when you get into the weeds, one of the things that the existing spending limit wildly punishes you for is changing the ratio of tax expenditures as between the school district and the municipality. So in 2014 or so, the Sullivan administration, we have one tax cap for the whole city, and historically it's been split pretty 50-50. But the amount that the school district can spend is throttled by a state statute. And sometimes there's a little bit of money they can't touch. And in those times, the municipality has more often than not said, we'll use that money. When you do that, you're spending more than you used to be spending, even though the total amount of tax collections that are coming into the municipality writ large have not changed and are still throttled by the tax cap. The Sullivan administration, as I recall, just didn't really attend to that. The other is, in addition to tax revenues, you can take non-tax sources in the municipality, and one of them is utility dividends. There was one year when the Sullivan administration went to Solid Waste Services and declared a $5 million dividend, and that put them way over the spending limit. But those kinds of things don't seem, from a public policy perspective, to be reasons why you wouldn't allow the police department to be funded or the fire department to be funded. I mean, it sort of doesn't matter from an external perspective how the internal workings, as I see it, from the internal workings of the municipality are divvying it up as between the school district and the municipality, as between tax collections versus utility collections. If we have a system that is ratcheting the tax cap, that is ratcheting tax inflows so that those are predictable and contained, it seems like the only reason you would have an additional spending limit is to make sure you haven't blown through your savings. If Bill Gates were to show up and say, hey, guess what, I'm going to spend an extra $1 billion on Anchorage, Alaska this year, the spending limit wouldn't let you do that.
And what's the legality of ignoring it, as has been happening?
I think the legality, my sense of, in the municipal attorney's world when I opined back then, is I think it was legal, but it was a little opaque because the ordinance would require you not to have these kinds of expenditures, but the Assembly is every year adopting a budget. So when they adopted a budget that was incompatible with that ordinance, I think they were implicitly sort of top-filing over the ordinance to say, but it doesn't matter because this year we have blessed this budget. That said, there was not a lot of visibility in that process, and I suspect if you were to poll some of those assemblies, they would have said, I voted for the budget, never having any idea that there was a spending limit, more or less, not even knowing that there was a spending limit at all, much less that it was not being followed.
Other questions?
So before you transition to Marilyn, I think there's a couple things. So Bill's kind of giving you a rundown of the history and our current situation and our desire to create one tax cap spending limit. Basically, it's one thing. We're not recommending that we get rid of it. It's just that we basically make them consistent. In the spending limit and the tax cap, there are elements that are similar, but they're applied differently. For example, the CPI. The CPI in the spending limit says last year's CPI. So when the CPI goes from 3 to 5 to 1, the spending limit jumps wildly like that. Whereas the tax cap, it's an average 5-year running. So it fills out. And it has an adjustment for population. It has an adjustment for new construction. It has adjustments at the spending, it has adjustments for settlements that allow us to do that in the formula. And so, my last point would be is that, the tax cap, and Bill can correct me if I'm wrong, but the tax cap was basically established with the principle that it should be reflective of supporting government services based on the economy, the population, and make some adjustments for sort of one-offs. And that's its intent. I mean, you can't go wild, but you also can't immediately go into the hole because it allows you to sort of manage the government services with the resources that you have. And so it provides some stability and predictability in our budgeting process. And so I think that's one of the key benefits of the tax cap as it's related. And then I think in 16, there was a voter, I think it was, number 8. Basically, we asked the voters again to sort of reaffirm the tax cap, and they did that, I think, in 16. I think it was in 16. But that's kind of the difference of the two. And then the key ingredient when we are going to the administration and the assembly to say, how much money do we have to spend? One of the things that we do is do a tax cap calculation. This calculation is what we end up setting the mill rate with at the end of the day. So how we do that from one year to the next, I'm going to turn that over to Marilyn, and she's kind of given you sort of this step-by-step process on what we had last year, and then all of the taxes that we assume, and how do we use that to go to next year? What are the assumptions we make? So, and if you have any questions for Bill, I'd maybe just pitch them right now, because I know he's got some other stuff going on, and if you, I can probably pitch it for him, but if I can't, I won't, and I will let him know, because I know he's got some stuff going on at the port. I appreciate your time to come in. So, unless you have some questions for Bill, I'd like to maybe let him go.
Can I just ask one thing then? Is about the politics or optics of the spending limit? Do you have any comment there? If the opinions that we heard from a couple of assembly members.
Yeah, that's not my expertise, but I take the point, and I will tell you this was our better answer. We had an earlier answer, or we had two earlier answers. The first earlier answer was maybe we should just repeal it all together, and because it doesn't make any sense. And folks were like, well, I don't really feel very comfortable just repealing a spending limit. So then we said, okay, maybe we will tweak the spending limit formula to make it feel more like the tax cap. And we tried that, but it was a little kludgy as a solution because they start from very different premises. And I think that was unsatisfying. And that's where the Assembly said, why don't you just pause for a few years and really figure this out? And actually, that was a wise course because I think we actually have a better answer now. I think this is highly defensible. I mean, you got to defend. The Assembly's going to really tell you, but I think this is defensible because I think this is correcting a spending limit, making it serve a useful purpose, where it actually would be a check on government in some ways. Where right now, if we just decided we don't care about the bond reserve, we're going to take us to junk bond status, and we're spending it all the way down. There's a resolution that says we're sort of intended not to do that, but it's not the law, and we don't have to report it anywhere. So, I mean, it comes out in the budget, but I think this would be a meaningful check on that serves an actual public purpose. So I think they would be able to say with a very straight face that they didn't repeal a spending limit, they made a meaningful spending limit.
And in 19, we were $5 million under the spending limit. In 18, we were $12 million under the spending limit, almost 13.
But in 15, we were over. I mean, so that's just how weird it is.
We were 9 over. It was weird.
Just that CPI jumping around effect.
And just the color of money that's in the calculation.
So now you're about ready to really get well. He tells a good story. But the tax
Marilyn's got a spreadsheet.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Go for it, Marilyn. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Bonbach, as Frank said. What we've got in the packet is the tax limitation, and I'm going to start with this is just part of the budget that the general government uses, and actually the school district has their bit of the tax limitation, but all of the budgets that are presented are balanced budgets. Funding sources equals funding uses, and the taxes are part of the funding sources that go into that balanced budget. Property taxes, so currently the general government budget is $516 million for 2019. Property taxes for 19 are $287 million, about middle 50% of the budget is funded with property taxes. Another 16% of the budget is funded with other taxes that aren't property taxes. And you've got the room tax, another 5%, and then all of the other funding sources support the rest of the expenditures for the 2019 budget. So this calculation addresses the limit on all taxes that can be collected for the city for a particular year. Every budget iteration, we do present this formulation in our proposed budgets, approved budgets, and our revised budgets. So how this calculation works is we'll start with the far right column, and that's the 2019 revised budget. And then there's line numbers that I'll probably refer to as we go down the page. So the very first section ending in line 11 is the base of the 2019 of this year's tax cap. And what that is that's just starting with the prior year's approved taxes. Some things you may note is the fuel excise tax is included in there in the base for 2019, but it wasn't included in the base for 18 because it was new in 2018. And then the marijuana sales tax, although we've had that tax for the past couple years, per the ordinance, it wasn't to go into the cap until 2019 as the actuals from 2018, or pardon me, the amount of the marijuana tax that started the base for 2019 was the actual marijuana taxes that were collected in 2018. So that builds our base. So the base for any given year is the property taxes approved for the prior year. Then what we do is remove any one-time items that were allowed to be taxed for in the prior year. So that's row 16, and you'll see that we remove some judgments and settlements and debt service. And we'll get, so those are the one-time items that we identified. That anything that remains will then be able to be increased by population and CPI growth. Currently, like Lance said, they're 5-year average. So we don't get huge swings in this, it's just a nice average 5-year growth that these taxes can be increased by. So then row 25, you see that that is our base for taxes that can be collected before we start adding one-time items that are not increased for inflation. So the one-time items would be new construction. And what new construction is basically the assessed value of any new construction identified by our property appraisal folks, multiplied by the prior year's average mill rate. So we say, okay, the taxes that would have been on those last year is this, and so that's what we can tax this year. So we increase our tax cap by that amount. Taxes authorized by voter-approved O&M. This increase here is the amount of O&M, which is operations and maintenance, that is approved on the ballots that are presented to the voters for bonds. So anytime you see a bond prop for, say, roads, then on that proposition it'll say, oh, plus this includes X dollars of maintenance and operations to actually maintain those assets. So the voters approve this extra dollars to maintain those assets. Once that asset is completed, then we will increase the tax cap to provide funding for that support of maintenance and operations of that asset. So that's what that does. So we tax for that. Then we also increase the tax cap for judgments and legal settlements that occur that are anticipated in this year, or that we recover for the prior year that weren't included in our original budget. And then this next line, row 31, is the current year's debt service expectation. So this is the bonded debt. This is the debt that was approved by voters that we can tax for. So this is where you might see on the school district side that if the state doesn't cover that debt service, we can tax to increase for that voter-approved debt service. So that's where you'd see it happen. So these are all the one-time items that are not subject to the tax limit. Included in your packet, we had the code and the charter language for the tax limit. So there's a couple other things that we can increase the tax cap for one times, which would include emergency stuff. So in the end of 18, we had that big earthquake. If there are costs that we incurred for that we determined we cannot recover from FEMA, this is where you may see us increase the taxes to cover those costs, because we put forth an emergency ordinance to declare that emergency. So the one-time items on row 32 added to the base of row 25 will equal the total taxes that can be collected for the city, which is row 34. So these are all, so once we have that total tax amount, then to get to the property taxes that can be collected, we reduce that amount by all the non-property taxes that are included in the cap. So payment in lieu of taxes, auto tax, tobacco tax, you'll see all the taxes in there with the exception of room tax and then some auto taxes that are in other service areas. So the limit on all taxes, less the amount expected for non-property taxes equals the amount of total property taxes we can collect for the year. So that's row 47. What we do with row 49, that's where Bill was saying that if the school district is doing the same exact calculation per code we have, this one cap for the taxing of the city. The school district has, does the tax limitation also, but their spending is limited by the state requirements, and so they may not be able to spend all the taxes. So that's where we may opt to show those in the general government side. So then that could increase the taxes that the general government can collect, and that's where row 49 comes in. So the total property taxes that could be collected in 2019 was $287 million, and that's row 51. If the administration, any administration may opt not to collect to the cap, that will, that's where the mayor can collect up to that amount. They don't have to. The administration can collect less. But what happens is, whatever that number becomes, which is row 56, the amount to be collected, that's what becomes the base for the next year. So that's my spiel. It's kind of exciting. Any questions and yeah, we're glad I won't speak for this. We can walk through this slower or more details. There's a lot of calculations that you put into this. So if there's
yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that if it's not intuitive, you have to, for me, I won't say that I'm a slow learner, but I have to go through it a couple times to sort of make sense. And then once you do it, you basically, you start with, you look under 2018 revised, and you go to the very bottom and you see 283,527. You circle that, draw a line to the very first line and the number, what is that, row 2 in 2019. That's the property tax you start with. And then we make assumptions. And if you can look at, if you look at rows 3 through 10 in 2019, okay, they look amazingly similar to rows 37 through 43 in 2018. Because what we have to do is we have to start from last year as a base, and then, so that gets us, and then we added marijuana in. And then you make an adjustment based on that number for the tax cap for population and CPI, because that's where you're, the one-time things for, says, for example, in 2018, we paid $4.7 million in judgments. But in 19, we don't know that, so we take it away, right? Until we figure out if we have any more. So it's basically, you start with the base. If anything changes in the non-property tax stuff, you make those adjustments first. If we get more money in non-property taxes, then the property tax money is going to be less. So you have to go through it a couple times, but basically if you start from where we ended, how much we collected, that's a property tax number we start, and then we look at the total amount of property tax, the total amount of taxes we can collect. Another light bulb that went on for me is that when you say the total amount of taxes we can collect, That's not the total amount of property taxes we can collect. The total amount of taxes we collect, there's a lot of non-property tax stuff. Gas, marijuana, tobacco, all of that stuff. So when those things change, when they go up, property taxes go down. But when they go down, when we start raising the smoking limit from some age to some age and people smoke less, we get less tobacco tax. If those were the only two pieces of the equation, we're going to collect to the cap, because that's the administration's philosophy. When one of those revenues goes down, the other one makes it up. Okay? So, but the point being is the spending limit's not nearly this methodical. And some of the pieces are not, and the other thing, and Marilyn can correct me if I'm wrong, we are required to apply this when we set the mill rate. Marilyn mentioned we generate one when we create approved budget, but we set it when we set the mill rate. It is that one point in time which we set the taxes. That's what we do by code. The spending limit doesn't say to apply it during the approved or the adjusted or at another time of the year. The way we would do it is if this were to occur, we would do them at the same time, that time of the year. So understanding a little bit about those formulas and how this works, I think is hopefully helpful for you to figure out what you want to do. And again, if you're afraid to raise your hand because you don't want to ask a really smart question in front of other smart people, give us a call. We can run this through you, run this by you one more time if it makes more sense. And Alyssa, since you're not here and I don't think you have this in front of you, we can run this by you when you get back.
I can
That would be great. I was going to ask if you or somebody could email me the spreadsheet.
Yep.
And then I can look through it and kind of give it a look before I ask all my questions.
Okay. Lindsay, you look wise. Is it all making sense? Okay. Lindy, you got it? Basically? Okay, there's going to be a quiz at 1:15. We're going to ask you to prepare the tax cap for the 2020 budget.
So, kind of a minor curiosity, but is there a spreadsheet of this that you guys are able to share by chance? Is that something that
So, yeah, I don't know why not.
Sure.
We do also present, like I said, the calculation itself in each budget iteration that we put online under muni.org. But yes, yeah,
And
we can send the Excel file.
And we have a history, if you want a history of the last forever.
I think there's a couple of us that are kind of dorky like that might work. But what questions do you guys have?
Okay.
I probably have a ton of questions after I mull this over, but just kind of more observations than anything. Plugging in this idea of the spending cap just sort of makes this picture to me simultaneously more complicated and more simple. I mean, the spending cap seems more of an optics thing. People are concerned about government spending money, and so having that cap in place almost feels more like a feel-good thing that's not going to directly affect the average Anchorage resident's bottom line, whereas the tax cap does. If there's a tax cap in place, you're only going to pay up to a certain amount in property taxes to the municipality. If the spending cap is in place, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get taxed more, I guess, unless the administration chooses to not tax up to the cap based on that. So that's just sort of one thing that I'm trying to wrap my head around. And the other thing that isn't necessarily evident in this is revenues that are generated by the municipality that aren't taxes, in other words, through enterprise funds. And that's, I think something that we're going to want to understand a little bit more about if we decide to look more into the stormwater utility, which will potentially be a new enterprise. Sort of what's the intent behind generating that revenue and how are Anchorage residents impacted by that?
Yeah, because that's all envisioned to be above the cap.
And then just sort of the third third thing that comes to my mind, I know looking back at our kind of work plan for the year, at one point we had talked about, I think next month, discussing new revenue opportunities, when we're going to be putting that toll bridge up on the Connect River Bridge. So that's all. My thoughts.
Did you have
Well, I had a question, but I think you answered it when we were talking about the revenue being above the tax cap. Although I'm not sure. I guess I'm confused as to what its purpose is. Then it's just spare change, you might say, for this and that, or it never comes back to the taxpayers in any way when there's revenue generated.
It doesn't directly, you're right, Carla, but what it does is that, as Marilyn mentioned, the total cost of our operating the government is $525 million. That's our expenses. The revenue which we get, which would include fines and fees, bus fares, permit fees, a variety of other resources that come in to support general government services. So in addition, all of those things are part of the revenue stream. Investments, we put money into the trust, we get a little money out. So that's, there's hundreds of different types of revenues that come in. A portion of that revenue pie, about 56% of it, is from taxes. And the tax portion is made up of these, 7 categories. Property taxes, alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, aircraft, those. So when we say, the taxes that we use to support government, it's basically about 56% to support government. The other piece is, and that's how we, to support the services, and that's how we generate a department's individual budget. So we'll look at, let's say, Carla's in charge of street maintenance.
Thank goodness.
Okay. So she's in charge of street maintenance. What we'll do is we'll say, Carla's total cost is $80 million. That's her total cost of existence. Let's just say it's $80 million. Then what we will do is we will find out if she has any indirect costs that she's charging to other departments or benefit you're getting from another department. Let's say you charge Parks and Rec, but it's not real cash. $10,000 a year to plow whatever that is. So that's your total function cost. But your total direct, the amount to put service on the street, is that $80 million number. Then we have this $20 million where it's kind of money going in and out, and the net of that is, say, 10. Okay, so your total cost of existence is $90 million. That's your total cost. The next thing we're going to do is, do you charge for anything? Let's just say that you charge the airport. You charge the state of Alaska $5 million a year to plow their roads. Okay, we're going to look at that as a revenue stream. So your total cost now, your total expenses were, let's say, 90 or 80 million, but you're bringing in money. Mm-hmm. You're bringing in money from that. So your total required money to exist is $75 million. We're like, do you have any grant money? Are you getting any one-time stuff? And you go, you know what, we got this one-time hit of money from the state, the well-oiled machine. Next year they want us to sand the runways. So they're going to give us another $7 million, or let's say $5 million. You're down to $70 million. Then what we do is we go, all of the departments, and they say the amount of money we have to tax people for your existence is the $70 million.
Gotcha.
And we do that for everybody. And so then we use that $70 million is part of the total amount of taxes we need to collect if we can, because we're going to look at all of those other revenue opportunities to cover your bets before we touch the taxpayer.
So what is the benefit, and I'm sorry to get us running down a rabbit hole, but what is the benefit if I'm in charge of street maintenance to even fully disclose the revenue that I have coming in? Do you know what I mean? Wouldn't it be better for me to inflate my expenses and
that's why you have an Office of Management and Budget. and to maybe to their detriment, I have been in those direct service departments. So and the other thing is that we might not know right away, but we will find out, because they're like, how are you buying that when you don't have any money? And they're like, well, we got this thing. And we're going, you know what? Good. You got $80 million to operate, you need $75 million of revenue. You know what we're going to do? We're going to lower the amount of money we have from the property taxes. Or if Lila's in a situation where she has to fight a fire, and we only gave her $50 million and she needs 55, we're going to take the $5 million in taxes and we're going to give it to her, and there's no change in property taxes.
Okay.
I mean, in basic philosophy, that's what we try to manage. It's, as Marilyn mentioned, the amount of money that we spend in this budget, the amount of money that we put as expenditures, we try to project those revenues, and that includes the taxes. So we do everything we can, except for in the event of an emergency, like an earthquake. We have to dip into that too. We do everything we can to keep track of them. That's why we do these reports, to find out if they're running hot and why they're running hot. But yeah, we do everything we can, Carla, to make sure that they're, first of all, taking advantage of grant opportunities. That we're not going to penalize a department for receiving a grant and then take their regular monies away, because if they got a grant to basically...
That's how the federal government does it. It works perfectly.
Well, not so much, but that's not how we roll. So that, maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
I think I got
Thank
that
you for
about
that.
right now. Yeah.
So I know that you gave us last time some ordinance language that wasn't adopted from like 2016 that was trying to address this.
Use this one.
And that's
Use this one.
So the new formula would, it makes the calculation the same as the tax cap. So then what Bill was saying then about, sometimes, the municipality does, get this, like Bill Gates gives a bunch of money, there's residual school district money or utility dividends that would be over the amount of the tax cap. So how are we dealing with that issue then?
So in the tax cap, it allows us to do that one-time adjustment, because next year when we we take it away. The spending limit would basically say, thank you for the gift, but you've met the limit of spending. Thank you for the gift, but don't spend.
Okay, so it does allow the flexibility to accept
Yes.
that revenue.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I have something.
Thank you. So for you guys, I'd ask you to just noodle on this. This would basically sort of be the working draft. If you have comments or questions or clarifications or betterments of it, I think this is where we would go. And I can send a Word version to you.
Yes, could you do that?
I can do that. You guys edit away, send them to me. I'll toil on it. I'll get them back to you prior to your August meeting, and then we can go from there.
Anybody? Any other thoughts on this? Okay.
I actually have, if you don't mind, through the chair. The spending, I see the advantage of having the tax cap and the spending limit. And I realized, because we talked about this last time, about what happens if Bill Gates walks in and gets, $5 million and we can't spend it. But it seems to me that somehow the spending limit could be amended, or it could all be amended to say that the spending limit is limited to the taxes collected, you know what I mean? And any grant / gift that is ancillary or separate can be expended and not part of that spending limit. Do you know what I mean? Because if it's not coming out of our pockets directly as taxes, then I don't see the harm in using the benefit, having the benefit of the money. I think the spending limit is a fantastic idea if we're talking about the money that the muni is collecting from its citizens. They should not be able to burn through more than what they need. But if you get money from some other external source that is a gift, that, you know what I mean? I wonder if it can be written where it's written like that. The spending limit is directly limited to the tax cap in money collected through taxes.
Not 100% sure I follow. So you're saying,
Because I'm not 100% sure what I'm talking about.
you would want the spending to be limited to the amount of taxes collected, or you would?
Oh, yeah, I would.
Okay. So then the event of like external money coming in, that would go to like the excess money would go to like tax relief, or
No, the excess. Okay, so
I think I get
yeah,
it. So
yeah,
basically,
right.
correct me if I'm wrong, Carla, this,
Oh, I will.
so basically, we have 525 that we're spending. 56% of that is of a certain color of money.
Right.
So the spending limit would be tied to the amount of, on the tax piece, but not the total piece?
Oh, now you've confused me.
I thought that's what you're saying too.
Yeah.
Jeb knows what I'm talking about, don't you? No?
Well,
I thought I saw the look of,
I mean, I think I get in concept what we're talking about here, but then the devil, where we get wrapped around the axles, how we define this sort of, I mean, let's be realistic. What kind of gifted money are we getting year to year? And are we going to limit ourselves to, sort of being, exempting gifted money? Or are we going to limit ourselves by exempting enterprise fund money? Are we going to tie this directly to
the
tax
enterprise
cap?
money, though, Lance is saying is within all of these calculations. So if you're taxing me $100 and you promise me on a spending limit that you will not spend over that $100, no matter what, you've taxed me $100, you won't spend over $100. But then you say, Carla, guess what? Tasha gave me a $20 bill and said I can spend it any way I want. Spend it. It didn't take any more taxes out of my pocket, and you still within the spending limit of my promise of not spending more than what you taxed me. It's a gift that can be spent. That's what I'm saying. Can we write it somehow where what you've been taxed is what is within the spending limit? But any money that comes outside of the taxes of the people is not part of that spending limit.
Hey, this is Bruce. I don't know if anybody else wants to know how to get this. What if the spending limit is equal to the tax cap, then what is the purpose of the spending limit?
Alyssa, you'll have to repeat yourself. I'm sorry. I couldn't hear you.
Sorry, so my question is, like, thinking of the scenario that you're putting forth, Carla, if the spending limit is equal to the tax cap, then what is the purpose of the spending limit?
Or whatever the ratio is, yeah. Did she say the spending limit is equal to the tax cap? Or unless, obviously,
So why would we have the spending limit? What is the purpose of it?
because if you don't have it, then they can spend past what they've taxed you.
I guess I see that we're unable to save money to pay for things in the future. Should we want to do that if we put a spending limit there, like, if we collected $100 in tax for 5 years and didn't quite spend it all because we were saving for some capital project.
Then you're under the spending limit.
Be able to spend that money because we have a spending cap. Does that make sense? At least that's how I'm thinking of it.
It doesn't make sense to me.
Okay.
But if someone can explain it, that would be good.
I mean, I think that what the tax cap is all focused on the limit amount of money that we can collect in taxes,
Yeah.
particularly property taxes. So it sets that limit on how much we can collect. And literally, the only time we could ever spend more than that is in the event of an emergency. Because the alternative would be we collect $287 million to run the business, as run part of our business. And we run into an earthquake, or we run into a big fire, or whatever it might be. And we have to spend $10 million. There's two ways to solve that. We can dip into our savings to solve it temporarily, or we can stay within the amount of taxes that we've collected, shut something else down that year for $10 million to pay for the emergency, which would then keep us there. But we would have to limit our services to other things in order to stay within the 287. Because the way the tax cap is, it allows us to not only dip into the savings one time, but allows us to recover from that, which was not part of the spending limit
So
plan.
you're saying that there's never a time when the spending limit even comes into play, except for emergencies?
I mean, current or proposed?
I'm just saying, if
I think we
If
heard
la-
it's basically a non-entity at this point. It's just that.
if Lance is saying that we collect $100, we only spend $100 no matter what, unless there's an emergency.
And an emergency could be a judgment or a settlement, because we don't plan for those. right? But we have to pay them.
Yeah.
Lance, if we had a spending cap that said we could only spend what we collect in taxes that year, then if we had an emergency, we would not be able to pay for it as a spending. Is that correct?
We'd have, I think, two choices. One is we could find something else that we budgeted that we wouldn't do and do that so that we can stay within the amount in that given year. So we settle a case and it costs $1 million. We can say, okay, police department, we're going to take $1 million out of you.
Don't go right to the police department.
Okay, bad example. Maybe we could pick any department, but basically we say, okay, we got a judgment for $1 million. They have a $100 million budget. We're going to take 1% of that to pay the judgment, but find out what you're not going to do for $1 million. Or the administration can say, we're not going to do that. We could do something else. So, I'm going to noodle on Carla's idea for a minute because I'm not sure that. Anyway, that's where we are.
So, I mean, I guess kind of we should come back to the big picture on this. What's the? I mean, but you know, Alyssa's question, like, what exactly is the purpose of the spending limit if it's, you know, if it doesn't impose any additional restrictions that aren't, you know, in the tax cap, right? I mean, and I think that it's kind of a political matter, right? That it's probably hard to just say we don't have a spending limit, but we don't want it to, you know, just create an unnecessary burden.
Pardon me.
Yeah.
I think I'm just really confused with when Jeff says it's there so we don't blow through our savings, but then we turn around and say, but we would never touch it unless there was an emergency. So there was kind of that not certain about that. And then we also have to think about protecting ourselves from, speaking of politics, from anything in the future where maybe you get an assembly gone wild, you know, girls gone wild thing.
It doesn't seem like the spending limit constrains that, though.
True. I agree with you on that. So.
I think what Bill was saying was that in principle,
Oh, Bill?
a
I
spending,
thought it was Jeff, sorry.
Yeah, Bill Falsey.
Sorry.
In principle, a spending limit would prevent, you know, blowing through savings or whatever. But yeah, I meant that as a hypothetical, not that it's effectively done that, right? I mean, it was like, yeah.
Well, Mr. Chairman, what I'll do is I'll send you the Word document. You guys noodle on this thing. If you have some smoothing or however you want to do it, and then I'd ask you to take a couple weeks to do that, and then I will put it back together and I'll get it back to you somewhere around the last week of July before your August 1st meeting.
Okay, I think that'd be good. Yeah, I think that'd be good. We can pass around a document. We have to deal with the issue. We have to probably coordinate through you or
Yep.
Lila.
So
right?
don't make
pass it around.
Jed, don't make an edit and then pass it to your peers.
Yeah.
Make an edit, give it to me. I consolidate, then I give it to you.
All right. We'll do that.
Note from the clerk to the OB.
Good.
You did it once, don't do it again.
Good. Then, so our next regular meeting is August 1st, and topic for that meeting will be.
I think it'll be a resolution on this, and I do think, as Jed mentioned, revenue streams. We're looking into 2020. By August, by that day, all the departments will have submitted our budgets. They're to us to 2020. They're due the 29th of July. So we're actively meeting with the mayor and departments right now about their 2020 and how they're going to move forward, because and we're in the throes of doing the capital budget. So doing the timing. Once they give them to us, we have a couple weeks to sort of put all that together, and then we have basically August, and then the mayor sends his message out September 1. So revenue streams, we can have a little bit more information on that, because I think Treasury will have for them, well, I don't know if they'll have it by then, their first report on 2020 projections.
Okay.
But I think the administration is already looking at, well, they have a lot of things they're looking at, depending on what happens. Well, when we get when we get to Monday.
Okay. So my one thing is that when it comes to the stormwater utility, I think, you know, we've obviously expressed a lot of interest in that. The Assembly wants us paying attention to that. I think the administration does. I kind of feel like our opportunity to play a useful role in that could pass by us pretty quickly if we aren't more proactive in table on that conversation.
Okay.
So I'm wondering how we balance that with other stuff in August with the annual budget formation.
Let me schedule. Let me look at scheduling a briefing so you guys are more up to speed on where they are and what they've done, and when would be the time which you guys should weigh in. Because honestly, Nolan, I don't know. I'm not. What they're doing right now is they're in a position to hire a contractor to create the utility, formulate all of the rules.
Right, and I don't.
We'll get you briefed.
Yeah, that would be What are the decision points where
Okay.
we could have where our input would be useful?
Okay.
It might be something where maybe an August work session on it or something like that if the timing
Sure.
is right.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's anything else. Yeah.
Well, look, I'll talk to. We'll get a hold of them and let you guys know what your options might be. First of all, I'll find out when you're best to weigh in and it's not too late, and then I'll find out if those people are available.
Right. Anyone else have anything?
I just want to thank Carla, Tasha, and Alyssa for willing to stick around and on the BAC. They got reappointed for another 3-year term on Tuesday night, so their term's up in June of 22. So it's good, and I have a couple other candidates I'm looking at to fill Michaels, and Lois has decided to resign. So this would have been her last meeting, so she's she's done. So I'm looking to fill those.
And you said there are some candidates.
I have talked to someone yesterday about their interest. They were hoping to attend today. I suggested that they come and watch the fodder before they bail in for a 3-year commitment. And I told them that they would have the opportunity to just fill the term before they do a 3-year stint. And so,
Give them that quiz on the text.
yeah. So anyway,
Okay. Good. Thanks, everybody. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
So moved.